we're going to take a look at one of the earliest wars in recorded history, and a rivalry for resources that lasted for hundreds of years between the two Sumerian states of Lagash and Umma. So in the past, I've talked a bit about how the various city-states of ancient Mesopotamia came into being. They initially started out as settlements along the banks of rivers, and over time, and with improved irrigation and farming techniques, these settlements grew from villages into towns, and then into what we'd recognize as cities. Though it's pretty clear from archaeological evidence that armed conflicts between city-states occurred, we generally don't have the details as to why or how a certain conflict resulted in a war. One exception of this comes from inscriptions and cuneiform tablets found in the ancient Sumerian city of Lagash. This city was actually part of a kingdom that consisted of three major cities: Girsu, which was the capital, Lagash, and Nina Serara. The patron deity of Lagash was Ningirsu, a god associated with farming, hunting, law, healing, and war. In the Akkadian language, this god's name is Ninurta. Other powerful Sumerian city-states of the early dynastic period included Ur, Uruk, and Umma. These three states, especially Umma, were often at odds with Lagash. In fact, they often allied with each other solely to isolate and battle against Lagash. In many cases, these conflicts had to do with farming land and access to reliable sources of water, two things that were always in short supply in the deserts of Mesopotamia. This doesn't mean that Sumerian city-states were always fighting. Cooperation with each other was just as important for their survival. The most common form of cooperation between city-states was through trade. For example, a Sumerian king named Urnanshi, believed to have been the founder of the first great dynasty of Lagash, claims repeatedly that he had ships from Dilmun, which is today in modern Bahrain, transport timber to his kingdom from various foreign lands. Other documents from Lagash mention commerce with the cities of Adab, Der, Nippur, Uruk, and also Umma. But let's get back to the conflict between Lagash and Umma. These two city-states were quite close to each other in terms of distance. In fact, Lagash's capital of Girsu was only 30 kilometers from Umma. We don't know exactly when the conflict between the two started, but the reason for it was due to a fertile stretch of land between them called Gudiana. According to a treaty from around 2550 BCE, Lagash and Umma had agreed to a set border between their two territories. At this border was a large stele, which is generally a large slab of stone with writing or images carved onto it. This stele has actually never been found, and it seems to have either been lost to the sands of time, or, if you believe the Lagashian explanation for it, was actually destroyed by the king of Umma. We know from other documents that the original treaty was arbitrated by a king named Mesilim, who was the ruler of Kish, a city-state to the north of both Lagash and Umma. The treaty was pretty advanced for its day. It contained a crop-sharing arrangement for a portion of land that was on Lagash's territory, but that could be cultivated by Umma under a lease with annual payments in bushels of barley to cover the maintenance of costs to Gudiana's canals. However, Umma repeatedly refused to honor this agreement, which led to frequent armed clashes between the two. Around the year 2470 BCE, Umma was decisively defeated by King Eannatum of Lagash. Now, before we move any further, let's talk a little bit about Eannatum. I mentioned earlier a certain Urnanshi, the founder of Lagash's first dynasty. During his reign, Lagash was very prosperous. In several of his inscriptions, Urnanshi tells of all the buildings that he commissioned, as well as the extensive trade networks that Lagash was part of. His son, Akurgal, has been pretty much forgotten, but his grandson, Eannatum, is quite famous. Though he was a shrewd statesman, he's best remembered, and actually was known during his time, as a great warrior, and his defeat of Umma only increased his stature. Due to Lagash's great tradition of record-keeping, though it may be a bit biased, we have a pretty good idea of what its conflict with Umma was about, and how it ended. One of these is a graphic monument that was commissioned by Eannatum that we call the Stele of the Vultures. Carved out of a single slab of limestone, the stele was erected to commemorate Eannatum's victory over Umma. Unfortunately, only fragments of the stele have survived. But through the painstaking work of archaeologists, it's been estimated that it was probably around 180 centimeters tall, 130 centimeters wide, and 11 centimeters thick. The stele contains several panels with different scenes. These pictures carved into the stone give us a glimpse at what warfare in ancient Sumer may have looked like. There's another object which gives more detail about the Lagash-Umma conflict. It's known as the Enmatena cone, and it was commissioned by Eannatum's nephew, whose name was Enmatena. I want to actually read to you some of the translated text from the Enmatena cone so that you can listen to Lagash's justification for the conflict. And I quote, "By the immutable word of Enlil, king of the lands, father of the gods, Ningirsu and Shara set a boundary to their lands. Mesilim, king of Kish, at the command of his deity Kadi, set up a stele in the plantation of that field." So here, the Enmatena cone sets up a historical backdrop to the situation, saying that the great god Enlil, also with Ningirsu, the patron deity of Lagash, and Shara, the god representing Umma, have already set up an unalterable boundary between the two states. And they had chosen Mesilim, the king of Kish, to be the one to carry out their will and physically demarcate this border. Now, further on in the text, we learn the cause of the war, and not surprisingly, it's all Umma's fault. The text reads, and I quote, "Ush, ruler of Umma, formed a plan to seize it. The stele of Mesilim he broke in pieces. Into the plain of Lagash he advanced." Later in the text, we learn of how Eannatum resolved the conflict. Like in the past, the conflict is resolved yet again with a treaty. However, this time, in addition to the border being re-established where the Mesilim monument or stele had been, Eannatum placed a heavy barley tax on Umma. To further enforce the new treaty, he made the king of Umma swear an oath to the gods to once again not violate the sacred border and cross into territories belonging to Lagash. Things in the century following Eannatum's death in 2425 BCE were anything but stagnant. While his nephew Entemena did fight yet again with Umma, he also seems to have concluded an alliance with Lugal-Kingshidudu of Uruk. Lugal-Kingshidudu had just united Uruk and Ur into a single kingdom, and he seems to have not wanted any conflict with Lagash. Thus, he and Entemena concluded a peace treaty which was a major blow to Umma because with this alliance, Umma had officially lost its once staunch supporter and ally against its greatest enemy. All was well for Lagash. It was prospering, was powerful, and had few external enemies that could challenge its dominance. But then, an unexpected turn of events occurred in Lagash. For reasons that aren't exactly clear, the priests, or at least a group of them, obtained political influence far beyond their religious role. One of the high priests even appointed his son, Enentarzi, as king. It's not surprising then that with the priestly class having a monopoly on power, after all, they controlled all of the religious institutions as well as the monarchy and government, that corruption became rampant. Enentarzi's successor, Lugal-Landa, who was also from the priestly class, was known to be extremely corrupt. During his reign, more than half of all land in Lagash was under his control, along with the temples and religious sanctuaries. Those who disagreed with Lugal-Landa were dismissed from their positions. Heavy taxes were put on the population, with people going heavily into debt. Things got so bad that according to some documents, impoverished parents had to sell their children to help pay off their debts. This, along with the grossly uneven distribution of land, no doubt played a large part in the overall dissatisfaction of the citizens of Lagash. After 6 years of such corruption and tyranny, Lugal-Landa was overthrown by Uruk-Kagina, a king who, though not a priest, believed that he was divinely appointed to clean up the mess that the once wealthy kingdom of Lagash had become. Uruk-Kagina saw himself as a reformer, and along with being a capable ruler, is best known for coming up with possibly the first known code of written laws. Now, I know that this honor usually goes to Ur-Nammu or Hammurabi, but that may be because we've never actually found a copy of Uruk-Kagina's law code. However, we know about it and what some of the laws were from other documents that reference it. Unfortunately, it just wasn't enough. Lagash's weakness had also not gone unnoticed by its neighbors, most notably archenemy Umma. To the throne of Umma rose a certain Lugal-Zaghazi. Taking advantage of the political and economic turmoil in Lagash, Lugal-Zaghazi launched an attack on the city-state and was extremely successful. He not only conquered the principal cities of Lagash, Nina-Serara, and the capital of Girsu, but then set them on fire, massacred the population, and then looted and completely destroyed the holy temple of Lagash's patron deity, Ningirsu. After centuries of armed conflict from what started out as a simple land dispute, Lugal-Zaghazi had definitively ended the conflict with Lagash in total victory for Umma. One Sumerian scribe, presumably from Lagash, wrote a lamentation of the destruction along with a curse upon Lugal-Zaghazi. It goes, and I quote, "The men of Umma have set fire to the temple. They have carried away the silver and precious stones. They have shed blood in the temple Iengor of the goddess Nanshi. They have carried away the silver and the precious stones. The men of Umma, by despoiling of Lagash, have committed a sin against the god Ningirsu. As for Lugal-Zaghazi of Umma, may his goddess Nidaba make him bear his mortal sin upon his head." Perhaps the curse did work, but it took its own sweet time. After destroying and desecrating Lagash, Lugal-Zaghazi went on to conquer the rest of Sumer and parts of northern Mesopotamia. He moved his capital from Umma to the much grander city of Uruk and established a new dynasty there from which he claims to have ruled over the land from the Persian Gulf diagonally up to western Syria. If Lugal-Zaghazi actually ruled over that vast amount of territory, then that's quite an accomplishment. You would have thought that such a man would go down in history with fame and honor. In fact, you're probably even wondering why you may have never read about or even heard the name Lugal-Zaghazi in your history class or any other casual reading. That's because his short-lived empire was incorporated into that of another, one who would go down in history, at least in ancient Mesopotamia, as possibly the most admired and celebrated ruler of the ancient world. This would be Sargon of Akkad, also known as Sargon the Great. That's another story, but just know that by the end of his life, Lugal-Zaghazi had fallen from grace so much that after being defeated and captured by Sargon, he was taken from Uruk to the city of Nippur and tied like a dog to that city's gates for all to see and mock. With Lugal-Zaghazi's defeat to Sargon, the era we know as the early dynastic period of Sumer comes to an end, and the Akkadian era of Sargon and his descendants begins. And thus also ends the great rivalry between Lagash and Umma.